here we are at a rather blustery Toft Newton reservoir in North Lincolnshire, built in the early 70s for the now virtually non-existent steel industry at Scunthorpe. A place I used to fish a lot. About 75, 76, just down from here is where I actually had my first ever take on a fly. I think you'll find there's a very small blue plaque on the bank. Dream of Gill Fishers is the book that I always wanted to write, which sounds a bit of a cliche, but if I can just roll back to the early 80s when I wrote quite a few articles to the angling press, I realised it wasn't really enough. I got a little complacent because it's not actually that difficult banging out 2,500, 3,000 words, and I wanted to try something a little more adventurous. Then in 2005 I thought, well, I've probably fished long enough now to have something to say, so I started to write, and there was no structure, no plan, no research, it all just came out. I was quite pleased with what I produced, sent it off to a couple of publishing houses. One said, love the book, but you're not famous, so nobody will buy it. The other one, Orham Press, who were then in Bloomsbury, actually telephoned me while I was fishing for trout on the Swale and said, we'd like to do the book. Needed a lot of editing, hard work but fun, because at least you got the raw material by then. And it came out nearly 2 years after I'd written the manuscript. I'd like to say the rest is history, but I haven't retired on the royalties yet. But it's been an extraordinarily gratifying thing to have done. In terms of the feedback from people who've read it, it's been a real buzz. When I wrote Gill Fishers, I did describe it as a journey. It was sort of autobiographical, but then it moved around into all sorts of different areas, so it didn't necessarily follow a logical sequence. And I thought I'd said everything I'd wanted to say, but as soon as it came out and I reread it, I realised there was a great deal more to say. I'm currently working on my next book, which is the same theme but in more depth, and it's evolving to be very much a sort of love story for my local rivers in North Yorkshire. I never had a vocation for my work. I'm a lawyer, but I can't say it's something that I always wanted to do. It was always a means of funding my fishing. So compared to many people, I don't think I got quite the gratification from the day job that probably my father did. He was a GP. And yes, it has changed my life because it's something I did by myself, relying only upon my own resources. And what is extraordinary is just how many people have got in touch with me having read it. Nearly all in a very positive way. Sometimes just people wanting it signed, other times people wanting advice, because the strange phenomenon is that if you write something, people think you know what you're talking about. Not necessarily the case, but very flattering nevertheless. So it has changed my life, and in a very positive way actually. It's given me the confidence to try for another one. I had a very difficult relationship with my father because he was a GP who absolutely adored his job, and I never found the perfect job, and I think I was a disappointment to my father because to me work was always just a necessary evil. And when I wrote the book, my dad had died just a few months before, and as usually happens, a death tends to polarise one's thoughts about somebody, and in hindsight I was probably rather unfair on him. I don't think he'd be too disappointed in me now. I think he'd have been very proud of the fact I wrote a book. I know my late mother would have been, because she was an absolutely avid reader. Dad was very practical, Mum was much more artistic and loved the arts, loved theatre, loved reading, and I suspect I've inherited rather more of her genes than my father's. So yeah, there was some baggage when I wrote the book, but I think I've probably put that away somewhere safe now. I've always been a loner. I've always had a dislike of any team sports, any group activities. And I think most good anglers, not that I would necessarily say I am one, are loners. you need to be very self-reliant. You need to have a relationship only with the water you're fishing rather than the people you're fishing with. Great to meet up at the end of the day with your mates, but I would far rather be by myself and the river. What makes an angler? That's a really, really difficult question to answer. A few years ago, I think it would have been a lot easier. Anglers were people who just liked fishing. It didn't matter if it was trout, grayling, carp, bass, cod, or whatever. People just like fishing. That's what I like doing. I think people these days, sounding like an old fart, sorry, tend to narrow their sphere of activity as fishermen. They describe themselves as carp fishermen, or barbel fishermen, or trout fishermen, or commercial lakes fishermen, God forbid. So fishing covers a very wide church of people. What makes a good angler is observation, resourcefulness, determination, and absolutely not patience, and absolutely not the tired old excuse of saying being by the water is enough. It isn't. If I want to go out and have a nice day, I'll have a walk. If I fish because I love to catch fish, not just being outdoors. Angling is reputedly the biggest participant sport in the UK. I'm not absolutely sure that it is, but I think the Environment Agency sell a couple of million licences. Sorry, bloody take. So you'd think with that number of people, you would have a pretty strong lobbying body. Surprise, surprise, we haven't, and we never have, but I hope that we will. The Angling Trust was formed a couple of years ago now, and it's got a shameful 15,000 members, which is pathetic, but angling desperately needs a unified voice. It has been factionalised so much. We have particular groups specialising in match fishing, in commercial fishing, in trout fishing, and virtually every other type. I have actually great hopes for the Angling Trust, and I'm particularly impressed that the ACA, who I've belonged to since 1971, threw their hat straight into the ring with the Angling Trust. I have to say I was massively unimpressed that the Salmon and Trout Association managed to find some convenient legal reason not to join them. STA certainly got some political clout, but to me it's lost whatever credibility it ever had by not joining the trust. The way forward, seems to me, is that angling must have a strong, unified voice, even if that means some groups swallowing their slight differences. They seem to think that because they're match fishermen and not trout fishermen, they're somehow different, somehow other. They're not. We're all in the same boat. I fish for everything, and for that reason, I don't have a problem at all in joining the trust, and I wish more anglers did the same. One key question is who should be the public face of angling? The trust, hopefully, is going to be the way forward, but just having a body isn't enough. We need people in the public eye who can actually do our sport a credit. And with few exceptions, we haven't really had those. We've had, obviously, Chris Yates, John Wilson, various other well-known anglers who've done a very good job of portraying angling as the sport we know and love. However, I don't think that's really going to engage the public. I think they still regard us as reasonably harmless eccentrics. We do need people who are in the public eye, who are well respected, articulate, influential, who can actually do their bit for angling. And I wouldn't want to criticise any of the names I'm going to mention because they haven't done enough, because the very fact we know they're anglers says something. But we need people like, let's start with royalty. Prince Charles is a keen fisherman. It'd be nice to see him being a little more public spirited, if you like, about the sport he's done since he was a child, which his grandmother did as well. People like Jeremy Paxman, startlingly articulate guy, hugely well known, quite an intimidating guy, but I think he could take on anybody who came up with the usual tired arguments against the sport. One thing I do mourn is the passing of the traditional tackle shop. Just like record shops, they've become an endangered species. It's so easy just to go onto the web, get onto Amazon, get your favourite CD. Similarly with fishing gear, get on the web, Google a decent supply and away you go. But what we've lost is the opportunity to bump into other anglers, to have a chat, to spend an hour in a tackle shop on the pretext of buying a couple of Alsey bombs, but actually just talking to other people. And there's that whole fantastic smell of tackle shops. I remember the shop in Castleford when I was a child, and I wish we had actually bottled the smell. You'd walk in and your nose would prickle from the ammonia smell of maggots, then the smell of ground bait, smell of anglers in their wellies. Not necessarily a wholly attractive smell, but in a Proustian sort of way, it certainly would take me right back. Get rid of the swamp, hold on. Carp fishing is something I used to play around at doing in the 70s. Oddly enough, not too many miles from here is where I caught my first carp at a strange water called the Lakeside Lido. And I was never a good carp fisherman. In fact, I was never even a mediocre carp fisherman. But I did know some extremely good carp fishermen. People like Mick Brown from Lincoln, used to know Rod Hutchinson vaguely, Kevin Clifford, people like that, who were all extremely capable carp guys. And most of all, they were people who were constantly thinking, constantly inventing new ideas. I just wonder whether carp fishing has now lost its way with the obsession with people staying at a single water for weeks on end under a bivvy. The technology is pretty frightening. No objection to technology per se, but it may have gone too far. And frankly, when it comes to obituaries in the fishing papers because some fat bloody carp has died and anglers are in mourning and wearing black armbands, something is wrong with carp fishing. I'm not a tackle tart. I don't always buy the latest new stuff, but I buy the new stuff if it's better than the old stuff. But equally, I don't think the old stuff is as good as most of the new stuff. If I don't need it, I'm not particularly sentimental. I get rid of it, I give it away, or I sell it. There's the odd exception. There's a rod which my mother bought me in 1968. Also a match aerial reel she bought me, I think, the previous year. And there's my original diamondback fly rod, which I bought in 1981. Incredibly soft action carbon rod, which has been broken, it's been stamped on, it's been re-ringed, it's falling apart, and it's probably caught a couple of thousand trout. But that apart, if it wears out, sling it away, buy a new one. Fishing isn't about the gear, it's about catching the fish. I'm lucky to have a number of close friends, probably half a dozen or so, very close friends. And with only a couple of exceptions, they're all people I met fishing. That doesn't mean we just talk about fishing, we talk about lots of other things. Because I think, as I was saying earlier, I think most fishermen are loners, but loners can be quite social animals as well when they recognise a kindred spirit. And I've spent so many fantastic hours with a whole variety of friends from, as they say, all walks of life across the UK. I used to fish with a very close friend of mine, a man called John Stevens, who tragically died about 10 years ago in a couple of months' time in a car accident up in northwest Scotland. And in the book I remember writing about a particular evening on a beautiful loch called Loch Borrowley when I had probably the closest to a perfect evening, in the fact that the ripple had stopped, the loch was very calm, not always good up there, but it is when the buzzers are on. And I remember catching a trout just under £3, and as I was playing it, just looking down Strathginnet at Foinavan, at Arkle, the mountains down there, and just being with a very close friend and sharing that moment was something beyond value. Something I wrote in Jewel Fishers is that the best book ever written about fishing was actually written by Nick Hornby, who is a metrosexual sort of guy who certainly doesn't fish as far as I know. And he wrote a book called Fever Pitch, and it was about one man's relationship, and I use the word in its deepest sense, with his obsession, which was his football club, which I think was Arsenal. It doesn't actually matter. I don't do football, I don't do team games. But what the book did was to show how you can actually live your life, either intentionally or unintentionally. I suspect it's unintentional, through the medium of your sport. You see everything, you live according to the values of that sport. It matters that much. What I do is not a pastime, it's not something to fill the days with. It's something I need to do and I crave to do when I can't do it often enough. And Hornby's just the same, whether it's about his beloved Arsenal or about his music. And I certainly share the passion for music as well. I know how important it is to have a particularly favourite band, how you need to fully understand the meaning of those lyrics and why they have such resonance with you. So he's a borderline obsessive compulsive, and I guess I am as well. Fishing quotations, there's lots of them. Some are just tired old saws, others have more than a grain of truth in them. I wish the one which appeared on the hut at Two Lakes, I think it was, which said that time spent fishing is not subtracted from your allotted lifespan, were true. Who knows? If it were, I'd probably live to be about 120. The other quotation, and I can't remember who said this first, but it's been uttered by so many different people, including Richard Walker, I think, was about the various different stages which fishermen go through. And first of all, you want to catch the most, and certainly I did that back in my stickleback days. And then you want to catch the biggest, and yeah, I had the specimen hunting bit. I wasn't very good at specimen hunting, but I belonged to a specimen group, so I suppose I had some desire to follow the big fish route. And I've caught a few big fish, some very big fish and an awful lot of mediocre ones. But you go on from that stage, and the next one is supposed to be the most difficult. It's not quite difficult. What does difficult mean when you're fishing? Difficult carp water usually means you've got to sit on your arse for about 3 weeks before you get a bite. That isn't difficult, that's just tedium. Difficult to me is the smart brown trout lying in an eddy behind a rock, which you can see taking olive. You know drag's going to be a real problem. You've got an alder tree behind you, you've got a sycamore just above you, and you've got to do a really smart cast to get it. And when you get that fish, if it's half a pound, that's great. If it's 2 pounds, it's a hell of a sight better. But that, I think, is the final stage. It's where you actually savour each moment. It's more than just catching the fish. It's the whole context of it. You can really work on how to enjoy it if you think about it. I read a lot of fishing books, and I read a lot of travel books as well. And I'm actually a pretty good armchair traveller and an even better armchair fisherman. I've read a lot of John Geerack recently, and he writes about the streams and rivers which come off the eastern slope of the Rockies, rivers like the Snake River. And I do have a hankering to fish out there. Not a huge imperative, but it's something I would like to experience. Similarly, I'd love to go to Patagonia. I read Bruce Chatwin's book In Patagonia when it came out, and although Chatwin, I think, was sometimes a bit economical with the actuality, it was certainly enough to snare me into visiting an extraordinary country with the most amazing sea trout and brown trout. But I see the advertisements in trout and salmon to go to Slovenia to catch grayling, and I think, well, I can catch grayling 20 minutes away. I don't want to go to France to catch a £60 carp. It's just a £60 carp. I'd rather read about it, to be quite honest, because I think there is a massive amount of fishing in the UK which I haven't experienced yet, and I'd love to try. It might be fishing for halibut off Oban, it might be fishing for pollock and bass off the south coast. I'd love to catch some bream. Not an ambition many people have, but I've caught very few bream, very few big roach. So yeah, I probably sound a bit domestic, a bit unadventurous, but I do like the variety of fishing which the UK can offer. This is a book by Ernest Hemingway called A Movable Feast. And Hemingway wrote this book when he was, I was going to say an old man, but he was probably about the same age as I am, but as you'll see from the back cover, I hope he looks slightly older. And he wrote about the time in Paris in the 20s when he'd moved there to live with a young family and his career was just beginning to take off. But he was writing it with the benefit of 30 odd years hindsight. The book is such a celebration of youth and possibility and the sheer joy of being young and alive. And I guess the older you get, the more you sort of miss somehow that endless optimism you have when you're in your early 20s. But it's not a maudlin book, it's a joyous book. I read my first Hemingway at university. I bought it in the university bookshop, and it was a book called Islands in the Stream, and it was actually published posthumously. But I was absolutely amazed at his style because it was so clipped. He didn't use long sentences, didn't use long words. It was short, punchy, but incredibly effective in a descriptive sense. And of course he wrote about things I loved. He wrote about shooting, which I used to do quite a lot of, but he wrote about fly fishing. And he wrote about fly fishing as well, I think, as anybody has ever done. So Hemingway meant a great deal to me, and he influenced me hugely to the extent where my early attempts at writing were a shameless rip-off of Hemingway, and almost well, not almost, actually a really bad parody of Hemingway. He's still an influence, but I hope I've developed my own style of writing. One of the most profound moments I think I've ever had was I went to Paris with my wife in the early 90s, and Joanne and I had to have a coffee in the Café de Magot, which is where Hemingway wrote at the time that this book relates to. And sitting in that cafe was immensely moving. And later on I went to Shakespeare & Co., which is a bookshop, shambling, run-down rabbit warren of a bookshop in Paris. And as in Hemingway's time, it was full of American students. And I bought my previous copy of A Movable Feast from that bookshop. And it felt, as Hemingway would probably have put it, a good and right thing to do. So I cherished that copy with its little stamp of Shakespeare & Co., because he was the man and always will be. These two floats were made by a man called Len Grayson, and I dedicated my book to him because Len was my inspiration and my mentor when I was a kid. I've been fishing a few years already and had caught nothing apart from sticklebacks. And Dad introduced me to Len, who was one of his patients, lived just down the road. And Len was a very, very resourceful and experienced fisherman, very much the loner, like myself. And he took me under his wing. He didn't patronise me, he didn't treat me like a kid. He told me I had to really work at my fishing. And what he did was tell me how to fish the lake down the road, which was called Turt Pasture. The pasture that said it comes out as Turt Pasture if you're in the West Riding. And he told me that these little self-cocking floats fished over quite shallow water, it's only a couple of feet deep, with what Len would call a chrysalid and what we now call a caster inside a size 18 hook, were remarkably effective for the roach. So I followed Len's instructions, got some crumb ground bait, something I'd never used before. Fished early in the morning, never done that before. Used one of these floats, never done that either. And bingo, I caught roach. Beautiful, what they would have called in those days prime red fins, that old cliche, but they were beautiful blue-backed, orange fin roach, up to probably about 3/4 pound. And Len really pointed me in the right direction. I would probably have carried on fishing. I would probably have learnt how to do it eventually, but he really kick-started me. And the thing I learned from Len was that you've got to know how to do it. You've got to work at it. It isn't luck. You've got to have the right technique, the right timing, right place. And it was instant results after years of absolute mediocrity and failure to catch anything of any note. So Len was a complete inspiration to me. He's been dead many years now, but I did dedicate my book to him, and he deserves it. So thank you very much, Len. You're not forgotten. Oh, there's a fish just behind you. Damn.